don't think there's anything to lose and everything to gain by doing so. I think one of the gains is that Islam will close down that space that's available for racists and Islamophobes to castigate and slander the religion of Islam. I think it will also open up new spaces for new dialogues and new discussions to meet the challenges of the 21st century, which are fairly major by the looks of things. And we can try and solve those problems together for the global good, not for the benefit of a self-interested, self-serving elite. But perhaps the biggest advantage to accrue to Islam by embracing modern secular democracy is it will switch the spotlight away from Islam, where it's been so maliciously focused these last 2 decades, and switch it over to illuminate those who are responsible for the death, destruction, and the exploitation that we see in our world today. And I don't think those people reside in the Middle East, and I don't think they reside over in the Orient. I think they reside, unfortunately, where I come from, in the West. And when I say the West, I'm talking about the colonial settler states of North America, and I'm talking about the former colonial empires of Western Europe. And I think the 2 biggest villains in the piece are my own country, the UK, and the US. And I think we need to put the spotlight on those 2 particular antagonists, so we can fully see who they are and fully understand the nature of who they are and what they do in the globe and on the world stage today. When I was here last year, I made the argument that these 2 states, the US and the UK, provide significant moral, material, and legal support for the commission of Israeli war crimes. I concluded my speech by saying that one of the reasons, just one of the reasons for that support, is that what the Israelis do to the Palestinians is merely a microcosm of what these 2 states do in the rest of the world. And I want to advance my case today by looking a little bit more closely at what those 2 states do. I've only got time to look at 2 ways in which they use their malign influence on the global stage. Before I do that, in my second half of the speech, I do want to go back and revisit the Nakba, that movie we saw earlier, giving us a flavor and a sense of what happened. Because I think if we revisit the Nakba, we'll get some sense of the incestuous relationship that exists between these 3 states, that is to say, Israel, the US, and the UK. To understand the Nakba, we can't start at the 15th of May, the day we're here to commemorate, nor can we go back to the day earlier, the 14th of May, when the British ended their mandate, and a few hours later the Israelis proclaimed their Universal Declaration of Independence and formed their own state. No, I think we have to go back at least 6 months to November 1947. And on the 27th of that month, 1947, the UN passed and signed into being its partition plan. There was nothing fair, there was nothing just, there was nothing democratic about that partition plan. The UN, under significant arm twisting by the Americans, allocated 56% of historic Palestine, not to the Palestinians, indigenous peoples, who you saw there in the documentary, but to recently arrived immigrants from Europe, the Jews, who then in 1947 only constituted 30% of historic Palestine and only owned 6% of the land. So this was an outrageous decision. In its very first act, very first appearance on the global stage, the UN violated its own charter. It violated its fundamental principle of self-determination. Is it any wonder the Palestinians were incensed? Unfortunately, violence, ethnic violence broke out. We saw some of that there after the partition plan. And in those first few months after the partition plan, up until about the middle of March, about 2,000 people lost their lives. But the partition plan wasn't actually the trigger for the Nakba. That honor must go to the Americans. On the 19th of March, the US ambassador to the UN, Warren Austin, convened a meeting of the Security Council to announce that the US was no longer going to abide by its own partition plan. I say its own partition plan because it had strong-armed it through back in November. It, for example, strong-armed most of the states of South America, who most of them, ardent fans and supporters of self-determination, would have voted on the side of the Palestinians if they'd been allowed a free vote. They weren't. So what had happened? What had happened in the meantime between November and the middle of March? Well, Alfred Lilienthal, an American Jew, wrote back in 1950 in his book, What Price Israel? Documents quite clearly the amount of pressure that was brought to bear on the Truman administration by the pro-Zionist lobby in the US. They weren't happy about 56% of the land being allocated to 30% of the population. They wanted to see much more being handed over. So what in effect the Truman administration was saying to the world was, we can no longer support a two-state solution. The message the Zionists heard was, we, the US administration, are not actually interested in Palestine anymore. And in fact, you've got 2 months now to get as much as you can before the British leave, because the British aren't going to do anything about it. The only thing that's going to stop you is when the Arab armies invade after the British had left. So in that window of 6 to 8 weeks, from the 19th of March up until the 14th of May, the end of the British mandate, some 300,000 Palestinians were forced to flee their homes in fear of their lives, mauled, mugged and murdered by the Zionist thugs as they were leaving. What I find disturbing, not just a catastrophe itself, a humanitarian disaster, was the role my own government played in this, the British government. It would appear, because the question we might want to ask first of all is, yes, was this a humanitarian disaster? Did the British fail in their mandate? Yes, they did. But I think that's the wrong question. The question should be, did the British, as a consequence of the Nakba, achieve their strategic objectives? If you ask that question, the answer is a resounding yes. If you read academics like Howard Zakar in his book, History of Israel, from earlier Zionist times to our times, or Ilan Pappé's history, Modern History of Palestine, or the evidence, archival evidence that's been unearthed by a scholar at the School of Oriental and African Studies in London, Victor Catton, it becomes very clear that the result was one that the British had engineered and manufactured. They wanted to see, their strategic objective was to see a Zionist state emerge on the west bank of the River Jordan, and to see an Arab Hashemite kingdom emerge on the east bank of the River Jordan. And that's exactly what they got. They never envisaged, never wanted to see an independent Palestinian state emerge in the West Bank. So to summarize what I'm just saying there about the Nakba, we see both governments, the American government and the British government, blocking a two-state solution in 1948. And I argue that those two states today are also blocking the emergence of a two-state solution today, now. Their job is to provide that protection I mentioned, that material, moral, and legal support, that protection, while the Israelis carry on with their silent ethnic cleansing of Palestine. If we want to help the Palestinians, as I'm trying to say here, is that we do need to understand the nature of these two villains in the piece, the US and the UK. which is why I want to go on now in the second half of my speech to see how they operate on the global stage, so we get a slightly better idea of who and what they are. Because I think as Westerners we tend to have a fairly rosy-eyed view of what they do. I think other people in other countries have been in the receiving end, have a much more practical, realistic view of what our countries have done. Let me look, first of all, I said that they exercise, in my view, a malign influence. By a malign influence, I mean they're not promoting global well-being. They're basically promoting their own national self-interest. Let's have a look how they do that through the way they exert political control over the global system. And they do that through the UN. And if we want to understand how they achieved that, we need to go back to 1945, to the first UN conference in San Francisco, which is miles from anywhere, very difficult for anybody to get to apart from the Americans. Okay, in 1945, in April, May, and June of that year, when they were setting out how the UN was going to be organized and run, the British and Americans had already planned this a year earlier at Dumbarton Oaks, launched a three-pronged assault for control. The first target was to make sure they grabbed the executive of global government. That means, and they did that by awarding themselves veto power inside the United Nations Security Council. So in effect, they got control of the UN itself. The next step was to get control of the legislative branch of global government. And they did that by making sure seven articles were written into the UN Charter. Article 103, for example, asserts the supremacy of the UN Charter over any other international treaty or document. So as a nation state, if you join the United Nations, you accept and acknowledge the supremacy of the UN Charter over any other diplomatic or any other agreement you may have made prior to that. So that gives the UN huge ability to amend and adjust and also make international law. So there's two branches of government that basically the Anglo-Americans have taken control of, both the political, the executive and the legislative. Well, what about the judiciary? What about the International Court of Justice, which was the first major court after 1945 to help deal with international legal problems?